Hello, I'm Chris Belisle, Executive Director of Corporate Relations here at Asia Society. It is my pleasure to present a new series of business programs conceived through the expertise and recommendations of the Asia Society Business Council on the latest trends and innovations on business in Asia. Today's program is the second of a two-part conversation. In our first part yesterday, we partnered with the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology in the International House of Japan to present scientific innovations that will shed light on how the business environment will adapt as we enter the post-COVID-19 era. Today, we will build on the discussion from yesterday to discuss from the business perspectives of COVID-19's effects on long-term business models guided by scientific research. We are broadcasting from Tokyo, Melbourne, Singapore, and New York. To summarize yesterday's session and guide us through today's session, I am delighted to introduce Bloomberg's Senior Asia Economy Reporter, Michelle Jamrisko. Michelle tracks regional developments across trade, monetary policy, economic growth and development, infrastructure, and innovation. She's now based in Singapore, and she spent 7 years in the Washington, D.C. Bureau covering the U.S. economy, Congress, and government procurement. Prior to Bloomberg, she was a White House correspondent for Kyodo News. Michelle, it's nice to see you again, and thank you for joining us.
It's nice to be here, Chris, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us. I'm hoping that you and your families are staying well at this time, wherever you are. We heard from 4 fantastic scientists in our day 1 panel last night or this morning, depending again where you're joining us from. And we want to build on that conversation with a conversation around how businesses are adapting and where they're headed in the post-COVID world, as Chris mentioned. I encourage all of you, if you weren't able to join that session, to access the video when it's posted this week to the Asia Society website. To recap, though, from our panel with those scientists, we heard a lot about striking balances. Aside from working from home and working from the office, it was also all about dealing with trying to maximize speed and potency in scientific experiments while running up against data privacy, bureaucratic approvals, and other personal health constraints. We also heard a lot about flexibility and resiliency, both in the scientific process and as businesses grapple with unique challenges during this pandemic. Scarcity of resources was a big problem mentioned, especially in the early days of the pandemic, but also looking forward as a concern as some governments might close off trade flows or hold on to supplies. On the positive side, our scientists thought that early aggressive action and vigorous testing were proving to be winners out of this outbreak and lessons learned for future crises. Finally, we talked about the need for more effort to communicate across scientists, businesses, and government, and about global cooperation that could fight the virus that has no borders. For our discussion today, I encourage our audience to submit questions via whatever platform you're using, and throughout the session we'll draw on those, as well as during the Q&A at the end of this session. You might already be familiar with our speakers, or at least have reviewed their impressive biographies in the event brochure on the website. But by way of brief introduction, we have 3 panelists with us today. First, we have Helen Brown, who is Managing Director of Business Asia and the Head of Communications and Outreach for the Australia-Indonesia Centre. She has her roots in my field of journalism at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and she has lived and worked throughout Southeast Asia, building expertise that she uses to help businesses and with communication and research in order to thrive in this region. Jesper Koll is CEO of WisdomTree Japan. Many of you will recognize Jesper as a founding member of Asia Society Japan, or by his prolific byline and commentary about the country. Before WisdomTree, he's had a number of roles, including as chief strategist and head of research for JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch. He's also served on several Japanese government advisory committees. And finally, we have Ashwini Kumar Tewari, who is the country head of US operations for the State Bank of India, a role that he's held since 2017. Ashwini has worked with the bank both in India and beyond for 27 years, and his assignments have been in a range of banking areas, including credit, international banking, retail banking, business process re-engineering, and bank technology upgrades, including an acquisition of a new trade platform. So welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. And first, I'd like to start out, kind of take us back to early 2020. And I'd invite each of you to kind of give a few minutes to introduce yourselves, including where you're located now, what your lockdown situation has been and how you've been kind of thinking about how this is all impacting businesses and what we might expect going forward. A lot to kind of handle in there, but if you could kick us off with some initial thoughts, maybe Helen, you can start us off.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Michelle, and welcome everyone. Lovely to virtually meet you and have you join us for this great conversation, and an honour to be a part of it. I'm based in Melbourne and it's 10 o'clock at night here on Tuesday night. We were just starting to come out of sort of the lockdown that had been imposed and has been incredibly successful in this country, actually. We're very fortunate. We've only had 102 deaths. I think 6,000 infections in total, and that's because of some very strong government and public policy and the federal government and state governments working together, people pretty much accepting the messages around what we need to do, and closing down the borders early, I think helped a lot. It's been a very strange situation, though. I was in Indonesia for 2 months prior to returning to Melbourne in mid-February, and at that point Indonesia hadn't declared any official coronavirus cases, but they'd been officially declared in the many countries around it. So you could see a little bit of what was coming. But of course, you know, everything changed so fast, and within a weekend, the country pretty much went into lockdown. As I said, we're starting to come out of it. The restrictions are slowly being eased. In the state of Victoria, which I'm in, we're looking at a spike in figures. So there is now talk of putting a ring around particular suburbs to try and stop the virus from spreading. And they're doing a lot of contact tracing around some family transmissions. So similar in some ways to many countries in the region. And of course, the impact on business has been immense. They've had to adapt so quickly to a completely new situation around customers not coming into the shops. A lot of Australian business has an export focus, not surprisingly, so a lot of that trade has been derailed, or they've had to change the way that the business is done. We've seen government step in quite substantially, offering a lot of packages, and that's kept the economy going. To now, that will a lot of those measures will stop in a few months potentially, and business was gearing up for this, the easing of restrictions, particularly in Victoria. But as I said, that stopped. So you've seen people who, in the course of 48 hours, have had to come to grips with the fact that they can't open up the way they thought they were going to. And this really is, I guess, the immediate challenge here for business, is this constant uncertainty. And then when looking ahead at how business manage that, you know, I think there is so much that is still unknown. For if you're trying to do some future mapping for your business, we don't know when international corridors are going to open up. We don't know when there's going to be a vaccine. We don't know if a second wave is going to hit. We don't know if, you know, people are going to trust a vaccine when it's available. If for some reason a rumour will take hold and people will start fearing a part of the supply chain. There are just so many unknowns. And I think the businesses that will survive, and from what we've seen, are the ones that are being flexible. They're willing to try new things. They're willing to really push their networks, and they are having to think about the values that they have in their business and how they align to this new world, where you have to care more about what's happening and your impact on the planet. So that's just a bit of a wide summary, Michelle. I hope it sets it up for my lovely co-panelists.
No, that's great. And it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts later when we get into more of the geographies, that you've kind of witnessed this contrast on the ground in the early days, and that's continued between countries like Australia versus others like Indonesia that haven't had as much success in taming the virus so far. Jesper, could you offer some introduction to where you're at and where you were when things started?
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Jesper Koll, stuck here in Tokyo, but I've actually been stuck in Tokyo since 1985. And as you know, it's a fantastic place to actually be stuck with. I've been here throughout the duration. I came back from, a business trip in early March, which was to Germany. On the return flight, there were only 15 people. But of course, in classic Japanese fashion, everybody was clustered together into the same rows in the airplane. So there was no social distancing there at the time. You've looked a little bit with, obviously the overall impact, on Japan. Basically, I think that Japan is sort of the odd one out, in the sense of that there was not very aggressive testing. There were not aggressive lockdowns, which are actually constitutionally impossible. It is impossible for the government to restrain people from leaving their home. So when the Americans rewrote the Japanese legal system during the occupation, they were very focused on granting human rights and individual freedoms. And as a result of that, Prime Minister Abe or Tokyo Governor Koike, encouraged people to enter a soft lockdown. But of course, given how compliant the Japanese generally are, when you walk the streets of Tokyo during Golden Week, which was sort of in early May, the peak of the crisis, there were fewer people on the streets here in Tokyo, than there probably were under hard lockdown in Manhattan or in Los Angeles. The overall statistics, you've looked at that. Japan, despite the fact that it's such an aging society, and you would have thought that as a result of that, the death toll, was going to be, significantly higher. That doesn't seem to have been the case. Right now the country has had a total of 953 deaths, which is, very, very low. Even when adjusted, to the overall population here. Now things are opening up. Last weekend, walking the streets of Tokyo, walking the streets of Kyoto, you're basically back to, I would say, 93% normal, with the exception that there is no tourists. And that obviously, the fact that the inbound tourism, has come to a complete standstill, that has had a significant impact, on a lot of small and medium-sized companies in particular, because over the last 2 or 3 years, I think, it's fair to say that the inbound tourism boom, was one of the big success stories of Abenomics. Now, the more interesting thing, is the cultural change and the change in behavior that Japanese corporations and Japanese executives, are actually having to go through. And I think many of you are familiar. Japanese corporate culture is a very proud one. Traditional practices, traditional, office interactions are very, very important. I mean, for Japanese, it's completely normal to spend 5 hours on a train for a half-hour meeting in Hiroshima and then come back. And indeed, when the soft lockdown here started in Japan, fewer than 10% of workers had actually experienced telecommuting. Now that the economy is opening up, actually, the latest survey suggests that 70% of the workers want to continue with the telecommuting. So, the change of corporate culture, the change of processes, that has been unlocked, where ironically, the pandemic has been a catalyst for positive change in outdated, outmoded traditional cultures, that is actually starting to come through here. And any executive that I've been speaking to over the last couple of weeks, everybody is agreeing that everything is on the table. So changing corporate culture, for example, the whole bottoms-up decision-making system, the Rengi system, which used to be very, very labor-intensive. Every little employee had to put their chop, their hanko, on the piece of paper. Now, this is actually being, digitalized. Which is a complete revolution. Even just a year ago, the Keidanren, the big business association, was completely opposed to digitalizing, the Japanese management and decision-making system. Now it's green light, full steam ahead. So I think that we will see a lot of changes, in Japan, actually changing the traditional and to some extent outdated, corporate culture. And I do hope that the overall decision-making process amongst corporations is actually going to be improving significantly. So there's kind of a joke here. We sort of say what Abenomics tried to do, Coronanomics is able to achieve.
Well, there's certainly a lot unique to Japan that we'll be able to explore. And one other area that I'll ask you about later is just the other economic variables at work before COVID that Japan was grappling with and that are kind of exacerbated in some sense.
Sure.
In these tough times. But we'll get to that in a bit. But first, Ashwini, if you could tell us where you are, what's been going on in your world over the past few months.
Yeah, so I'm in New York. And as you well know, that New York was the epicenter of the corona epidemic or pandemic. And therefore, while it was peaking and while it was really bad here, I was right here. And it was really reassuring to see, despite everything which is going on here, that the public convenience in terms of subways, in terms of buses, in terms of local transport was all available. There was no police checking people on the way, etc. So that was very reassuring. And this is in direct contrast to what happened in many other countries, including my own country, India, where the lockdown was extremely, extremely severe and no public transport. Nobody was allowed to go from one place to the other. People had to show IDs. So quite a contrasting experience in both countries. However, as a vantage point here, and now hopefully things have improved quite a bit in New York. We are into the phase 2 of reopening. Considering this, I would just step back a little and think that the history of this pandemic, the nearest history we have is 1918. People talk about SARS and H1N1, but frankly, I was in India then. And while we heard about these diseases, we always thought they are very localized. So we didn't have any experience of how to handle that either as personal individuals or even as businesses. But this one has impacted everyone globally. And the last one was 1918. And if you just look at that history, we have some reports or some writings on that now. And we find that people did not want to remember it. It was so bad, actually. And in India also, 5 million people lost their lives. And still we have very little history. I've read history in India as a student in my school days. And I do not recall any mention of the 1918 Spanish flu. So therefore, considering that as a background, as a history, we know that this is something we now are learning in a very different way, and the world is not going to be the same again. Now, in terms of how we as a bank, we are a very traditional bank. We are again 200 years old. So therefore, set up in British times and then amalgamated. We were a central bank earlier. So therefore, after all this, we are very traditional. We are modern, we are digital, but we are very traditional as well. We never had a facility of what we call work from home. We, of course, had policy. We were trying to do this, but we never had it. And this pandemic, it forced us to actually implement the work from home technology in New York and many other offices very, very emergently in just about 15 days to 1 month, which I think in terms of, if you look at a traditional bank like us, like Jesper mentioned, Japan, it got compressed. The process of maybe 6 months to 1 year got compressed in about a month. So therefore, there was a great sharp increase in digital adoption in our bank and also around us. Many of our sister companies also adopted this on a whole scale level. And this has really gone ahead. And for a business continuity planning perspective, I think it's a very, very good thing. Even though there are very few things which we can call good about this pandemic, this is one of those. Now, we have still to see how the work from home, people talking about the flexibility it provides. Yes, it does. But should we permanently have people working from home? I saw the panel yesterday and people did talk about that. No, beyond a point, maybe the mental health aspect also comes in, the social aspect of work also comes in. So we have to still study and understand those issues. As far as businesses are concerned, because we as a bank are intermediary and we handle businesses. So in the United States, the Fed's bazooka actions, these kind of actions have never seen, not even in 2008, have really calmed the markets, the capital markets, the debt markets. And in fact, the market is pretty much back to the February levels. And therefore, there hasn't been large-scale defaults per se, except for a few which were already teetering before this happened. So therefore, we are still to see how it plays out. And as the stimulus get stopped, or maybe the checks which were given or the payments which have been given by the federal government is stopped. We'll see how it pans out. So I think we are still not knowing many of it, even as the virus itself is very unknown and the vaccine and medicine are quite some time out. So therefore, this is something we are right in the middle of it. It's an interesting time, exciting time, going in slightly negative sense, but I think the human race is very, very robust, and it will survive this, even as it shows the fragility of whatever our ways of things were, and we have to take things like climate risk now much, much more seriously in our businesses.
Well, thank you for that. Yes, and the excitement and volatility in financial markets, I'm sure, would fill a whole other 90-minute panel. So we'll have to stick to the uncertainties in the business world for now. But you mentioned a bit about the digital adaptation, and Jesper and Helen, you mentioned some other ways that businesses are adapting. I wonder if we could focus in on whether, to the theme of the day, whether science has played any larger role as businesses are looking at long-term strategy right now. I mean, we hear some about people kind of reading up on the latest Dr. Fauci commentary, or looking at other scientific research, and of course tracing the numbers day to day in their constituencies and where they cover for work or other reasons. But is it really having an impact, from the board level on down, in terms of how are you going to survive and hopefully thrive past the crisis? Does anyone want to jump in first?
Okay, so just to give a few comments on that. Actually, frankly, there is so much information out there, and with a lot of uncertainty, even in the scientific world. And it is, it was very interesting as a banker to see the scientists acknowledging the uncertainty all the time. I mean, while we read science, the way things were presented to us as students was always fixed. That this is the principle, this is Newton's principle, this is this principle, and it was all absolute. Now, considering that, to see the scientists acknowledging the uncertainty which continues even today, as businesses, we have been watching this surely, but to follow what is going on and to implement in our workplaces, and for the key parameter for us was the safety of the staff and of course the customers. So therefore, we have been following whatever the CDC guidelines are. The cleanliness, in our bank, for example, before we implemented the work from home, we distributed the teams into two, and the teams were coming alternately to the office, and we had the sanitation going on. I mean, whatever the CDC was prescribing, the temperature checks, etc., we tried to implement all of that, and yet we felt there was scare, there was fear among staff, and few of them did turn out positive. So therefore, I think as far as digital adoption goes, this is definitely expedited and given a trigger to implement it very fast as a continuation of the business itself. But as far as the scientific advice goes, we are all watching it. We still don't have medicine. We still don't have a vaccine. And as and when we have, we'll surely have everyone, and make it available to everyone. But for the time being, we're just watching the guidelines and the advices as given by the scientists and the CDC, and trying to implement those so that the staff stays safe, and more important, are feeling reassured so that they are able to come to the workplace and not feel scared about it. So I think that's where we stand at the moment.
No, it's interesting what you say about the uncertainty being unsettling, especially unsettling given that it's scientists that you're used to hearing them speak in black and white and formulas, and everything checks out, and it equals something, and you're done. But I'm sure from a business perspective too, that can be quite jarring when you're looking for that expertise. Helen and Jesper, do you see things
similar?
Integrated? Yeah.
We're thinking about that, and you've reminded me that one of the most sort of consistent messages from business has been when they're talking to people about what they're doing and why they're making the decisions that they're making, or why they're not doing perhaps what people want them to do. They come back and they make a statement around everything we do, we base around the best advice from the nation's chief medical officers. And it's almost like that's the only thing that we've been able to hang on to. Is the science, that this is so unprecedented. We're dealing with a disease that we just don't really understand it at all. And all we've got is an incredibly talented and clever bunch of people who every day are looking at numbers and data and trying to pull it together in a way that gives some sense and coherence and provides some direction ahead. So business has seen that and it's gone, well, that's the only thing we've got and we need to make decisions and that's what we've got to base them on. So let's go with the science. And I don't think I've ever seen business revert back to the science in that way before. And people try, in Australia, you know, people generally do trust it. Of course, there's a lot of debate around a lot of the decisions that have been given, but we haven't seen any serious unrest or discord around it. The interesting thing, I guess, will be as to how long that lasts. You know, how will business just refer to the science and take advice, or will they start to see the sense of integrating some scientific knowledge into the decisions that they're making, even with their investments or their business models? You know, will it make them think more about is there any science around this potential opportunity that I'm looking at? Can I learn more about it through the science? I mean, I don't know, but maybe this could be one of the positive things to come out of COVID-19.
Yeah, and just for
I very much agree with this, you know. But you know, if I may sort of add a Japanese perspective to this, and obviously, you know, Japan. Look, you know, there's a disaster every 3 or 4 or 5 years. I mean, there's earthquakes, there's tsunami, you know, and obviously, you know, the science, the scientific research, the you know, latest modeling that goes around that, you know, is part of the risk management, you know, of corporations and of management. But I think that, you know, given the global nature of this crisis, you know, I think that, you know, the key issue actually is, particularly for CEOs, for leaders, for team leaders, you know, a corporation, a company is, you know, a grouping, is a family of people. And everybody's scared, everybody's uncertain, and just watching, you know, these data points of, oh my God, today it's another XYZ increase in infection. I mean, that doesn't help anybody. You know, putting these things into perspective, and more importantly, you know, for the team leaders, for the CEO to be visually present, you know, to do this. So there's a lot of Japanese companies that, for example, have instigated yoga sessions. You know, in order to look after their calf, and even though these yoga sessions are not done on Zoom calls, you know, that's something that keeps the team spirit, so to speak, you know, very much alive during this crisis. So I think that actually, you know, an aspect that Ashwin mentioned earlier, you know, the sort of mental health of your team, the mental health of your, you know, of your corporate leaders and of your team members. That's something where I think, you know, greater focus and you know, hopefully some greater science is going to be used from here on.
And it's, you know, it's interesting. I'm hearing each of you respond in a way that COVID has made things a lot more personal, it seems, even for businesses, in terms of getting into the health and the well-being and the mindset of their employees, and of course their own, as they kind of conduct business from home or wherever else and under restrictions. I wonder, I mean, that might be part of the answer to the question I wanted to ask you next, which is, you know, a year ago we were in between rounds of US-China tariffs, and of course uncertainty was the key word of the day then too. And you know, we had market volatility, we had, of course, businesses trying to plan and you know, rearrange their supply chains, think about how to avoid being caught in the crossfire, and plan ahead strategically. So, you know, what makes COVID so much different than that? I mean, I keep hearing from businesses that things that they kind of plan to do, you know, during the trade war, they're actually now pushing the button and, you know, accelerating further, or these decisions are going higher up the chain in ways they hadn't before. But what about this crisis has made it so jolting in that respect?
If I can jump in here, it's very simple. I mean, this sounds like a terrible thing to say, but it's a man-made, it's a policy-made crisis. You know, if you look at the past big, certainly the financial crisis, you know, there's a bubble somewhere, and that bubble collapses, the financial system seizes up, and then squeezes the real economy. You know, this is the first time, at least in my, you know, limited 30 years experience, that you've got generally, I mean, this is a global policy decision to lock down the entire system. And so as a result of that, the big question is really this entire policy uncertainty. You're completely at the whim, right, of individual governors, individual politicians, making decisions that materially affect your business and make it incredibly uncertain, right, on how things to do. Let me give you a concrete example that's very relevant, for Asia. I mean, as you know, Japanese companies, have a significant amount of factories and joint ventures in the People's Republic of China, right? And in fact, you now have, in terms of overall profits, Japanese companies depend more on the People's Republic of China than they do on the United States of America. And of course, what has happened is that, when the crisis hit, the Japanese flew back from China to Japan, all their senior managers of all those factories and all those warehouses and all those joint ventures. And here we are, and then, whether we like it or not, China was the first one to stage a V-shaped recovery. I mean, car sales are double-digit positive already. And so, the Japanese car companies are struggling because now all their senior managers, right, who used to run the factories in China, are now based in Japan, while, they don't really have a senior management team in the People's Republic of Chinese factories there, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a very, very interesting, issue that you're grappling with here. And of course, further out, again, what this crisis is doing is, Asia is recovering, the People's Republic of China is recovering, the United States is sort of bottoming out, but it's certainly not showing any signs of a V-shaped recovery, certainly not in car sales. So, sort of turbocharging the focus on Asia rather than the focus on North America, that's a big element, certainly, that a lot of Japanese strategists, right, corporate strategists are grappling with right now.
And I'm sure moving forward, the travel restrictions or the removal of those will also be a source of politics and a hurdle for business as well, right? So, Helen and Ashwini, how do you come to this part of the conversation? Do you agree with Jesper? do you debate his take on this?
Look, before the coronavirus pandemic hit, the Australian economy was starting to soften, and it's basically now considered to be in a recession, and that's the first time in 30 years. So that alone is quite a huge shock to business here, and obviously the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated that situation. So with the China-US trade war, that was already making business think about relationships with China, but I guess more with a nervous eye on what was happening. Perhaps not stopping doing business with China, because as you know, we are a huge trading partner with that country. China, we're so dependent on it for business. So they certainly weren't not wanting it as a market, but they're thinking about how do we diversify and how do we perhaps lessen that risk. And then, of course, we've had a few things happen recently with China imposing tariffs on our barley exports, for instance, significant tariffs of 80%. So that kind of goes back to the trade war situation and some of the geopolitical tensions and the whole balancing act that is so sensitive at the moment, overlaid by the coronavirus. So what COVID-19 has perhaps done is made companies look more at those alternative markets and think, okay, I really need to start thinking more strategically about a Vietnam or Malaysia or Indonesia or the Philippines, and start diversifying my risk a bit that way. Made all the more difficult because of the coronavirus, but definitely seeing more interest from companies in that direction. How we're already dealing with an economic softening, a spat between the US and China, which could affect Australia adversely as well. We've now got some tensions in the China-Australia relationship and coronavirus. So I think they're all now just looking for what are some options that we can incorporate that might ease some of the bottom line pain.
And Ashwini, I mean, obviously other things going on in the Indian economy as well. I mean, what has made businesses move, if you do agree that they have moved faster on certain changes than last year? I understand that India wasn't as in the crossfire as some economies and vulnerable to external, strife in the U.S.-China trade war. But has this changed the game for businesses there?
I think we are much more global now than we were perhaps earlier, even though in India, the consumer demand still forms about 60% of the GDP output. Having said that, every business has been impacted. I mean, to me, there are a few thoughts. For example, we talk about the resiliency of supply chains. You mentioned it earlier. Now, in the supply chain arena, the first thing which came up during this COVID itself, I mean, India at this moment is a country which is very strong in pharma, the generic pharma. And in America and Europe, a lot of the pharma supplies, the generic versions are by India, as is in Africa. Now, when this was going on, while we realized that 70% of the APIs come from China. So if there is a difficulty and China initially had problems when the supply chain came under stress. So we realized that even though we are the market leaders in generic pharma, we can't do it unless the Chinese leg of 70% supply is taken care of. And you can't just build that kind of supply, which was incidentally about 3x to 4x cheaper. Now they are increasing prices. So the point is that these supply chains are so integrated, even with India and multiple across the world, very difficult for businesses to just decide to switch off. However, having said that, as the other speakers, Jesper and others, Helen said, that businesses are now very seriously looking at diversifying and this trend of localization, that do we need to have a significant portion of critical supply chain within the country. At least the US is thinking very strongly of that. I do not know how much the president and his team will be able to mandate to people. Tariff, of course, is one option, but that doesn't really in the long run help very much. So therefore, supply chain is one aspect which definitely some localization, some resiliency has to be built into that. In terms of these stresses, I mean, this global pandemic is something which has given a huge, huge stress to everything. Demand, supply, everything. In our scenarios in banks, we do stress testing. And in stress testing, we look at 100 basis points, 200 basis point interest rate shocks, this way, that way. I mean, this way, the net impact of everything, I mean, if you include these interest rate reductions, which is directly bringing down the profits of banks, it has been huge, in addition to the business failures which might occur. So what I think is that businesses, while they are trying to adapt digitally and various ways in terms of supply chains, still is a long way off. I think it's still playing out, and there's so much uncertainty still there that businesses really, really do not know very well how to tackle this. They're just going along and trying to respond and react to as things come along.
Well, I mentioned some of those decisions you mentioned, even if they're made quite quickly, might take years to implement. I want to ask, as we talk about success stories and maybe the not so successful stories, I wanted to first kind of tackle this on a company and industry level. And I just ask each of you, I mean, are there already examples that you're seeing of a company or an industry that's really gotten it right out of this crisis? I mean, I guess digital technologies, of course, are an easy win right now in some ways, and they'll have to kind of figure out how to build on those successes. But are there other companies that come to mind or other industries that are really finding success out of this?
Okay, so if I can start off, there are sectors which are affected very, very badly. And for example, in New York City, I mean, since I stay here at the moment and I see how businesses are reacting, and the pulse of the New York City are its bars, its restaurants, its entertainment options, etc. And everything was closed. So how does a business like that survive in an environment like this when there is no certainty? People also are not coming, and they're not allowed to open at all. So what we found in a few cases, they were very innovative, and the curbside delivery. I mean, there were bars which were actually fabricating cocktails on the go, and as customers were actually putting out these orders on the digital platforms, and they were being delivered, and that's how they were able to survive. In addition to whatever the Fed stimulus measures and the PPP schemes were there. So there are different companies, there are different businesses which have been able to adapt. But yes, I think still it's a tough time, and it is very difficult for businesses other than technology. I mean, Amazon has been doing fabulously well. Its share price has gone up 25% since the beginning of the year. So we have those who have a natural advantage in this time, but there are others who have tried to adapt. It's still playing out. So we will see more success stories. And if I may just take a couple of minutes to talk about India, actually. In India, if you look at state-wise, I mean, I always tell people who know less about India, it's a aggregation of 29 countries. It's not one country, actually, because different languages, different cultures, etc. Within India, we have two states who stand out for the kind of response to COVID, which are Kerala and Karnataka in the down south. Karnataka has a major metro, Bangalore, so which is very well connected to the world. People travel there all the time. And these are two states which have really done well in COVID. Their numbers are way below than any other developed market or a developed country. And whereas on the other side, we have Mumbai and Delhi, who are the major cities, and these two states lead. And these two states together form almost 40 to 50%, and they have not been able to handle it so well. So it's a question of how well do you communicate, how well do you define processes, how well do you put people in place who you delegate, because you can't actually dictate terms from top. Here, the local level person or the person who is at the bottom of the pyramid is as important because he's the one making decisions. The hospitals, the health professionals, same applies to businesses. You have to delegate, give them authority, give them broad principles, and then let them innovate as per the local need.
Mm. And Jesper, I mean, you're in a part of Asia that's very much linked to the electronic supply chain, which is one that I think has been seeing some bright signs in some respects and maybe divorced of the weight of the COVID pressures. But I mean, are there industry, do you see tech as maybe a potential winner out of this? And are there other types of companies winners?
Look, I mean, that sort of, if you're a tech company analyst, right, what has happened is that your projections that used to be 5 years out basically got pulled forward, right, into 15 months, and that's a compression here. And, we all know who the big winners are. And it's almost embarrassing, when you look at the performance of the US stock market, how that's being played out, because it's effectively 7 companies, that are leading the entire rally there, right? So I think that, some of the winners there, I actually do think that Japanese industry, and I'm just going to make a little plug here, right? Japanese industry, because, whether you look at the car companies, whether you look at the capital goods companies, or whether you look at even the chemical companies, they have actually diversified their production map quite significantly, over the last 20 years, right? And, really, if you're a chemical producer, right, it takes at least, 5 to 6 years, to actually make a dent in the course that your aircraft carrier is actually going. You're not a tech company that can pivot, from one part of the business to another part of the business, right? Mm-hmm. So I was going to say that, if you're talking to CEOs right now, yes, you've got the COVID issue that you're dealing with, and that brings a level of uncertainty primarily, to your staff, to inside your corporation, the mind fitness, that your leadership team actually has. Strategically, I would position and stipulate that the US election outcome is going to be much, much more important. And particularly for Japanese, the question is, well, Trump or the current administration has a certain style of dealing with the People's Republic of China. The question is whether a democratic victory would actually significantly change, that overall policy. That's a key question, that Japanese CEOs actually need to answer here, right? Mm-hmm. The second thing I wanted to say is, look, it's very easy to say, oh, you're going to restructure your supply chain. I mean, trust me, a Japanese car company will never, ever build a new car factory here in Japan. Because your market is North America, the United States of America, and whatever is around there, and your market is the People's Republic of China. Everything else is an add-on. If you're a company like Toyota that makes 10, 11 million cars, right? So same is true if you're a base material supplier. I can't be far away from my end customer. if Toray Corporation produces the carbon fiber that goes into the Boeing aeroplanes, right, you must have a factory as close as possible, right, to that Boeing Corporation. You can't, diversify that and say, oh, I'm going to build that in Kagoshima and hope that I can continue to ship it, because your shipping cost is going to destroy you. Right. So I think, we need to be a little bit careful here. There is a digital world that can shift and pivot very quickly, but there is an awful lot of real, analog world, heavy capital goods stuff, right? And, that the world still depends on, and that's where all the components are being made from.
Yeah, it's certainly the localization of supply chains I want to get into a little bit more in a minute here. But Helen, I want to bring you in, and I'd like you to offer your own thoughts, but I wanted to tack one on for you, because I think it's something that's particularly relevant to Southeast Asia and perhaps to Australia too, of course, is the tourism industry and how that's, of course, battling its own challenges right now with the lockdown disproportionately from other industries, can't digitize the visits to these places. So how do you see that kind of playing out? And do you see businesses, again, going back to our other question, relying more on the science and integrating that into their long-term plans more so than they would usually?
Wow, tourism, that is a tough one. Pick an industry that's one of the hardest hit, that relies on people traveling, that relies on that personal interaction, that relies on people stepping out of their comfort zone and lockdown, and people learning skills from those personal interactions. People in the hospitality industry and the food industry and the retail industry. It's obviously one of those industries that is reeling from the impacts of the coronavirus. And I haven't come across anything yet that shows how they're moving beyond this or how they're dealing with it. I think, from my understanding, and happy to be corrected by anyone out there, is that they're all just coping the best they can at the moment. We've seen many hotels close down, just waiting for it to be over, or trying to adopt measures, relying on the science. Again, we're doing the best we can. We're cleaning twice a day. We're trying to make you as safe as possible, so don't give up on us. But that's probably one of the tougher industries that, in terms of the impact, where it's going to be a matter of time, because you can't do anything until you start getting customers back in, trying to connect with them digitally. But it affects so many things. And I was trying to think of an example prior to this conversation about an industry that was, shining a light, and perhaps not shining a light, but definitely being forced to pivot and making some gains in that area is the field of education at all different levels. And we're seeing this across the board. So in Australia, of course, we rely on international students to a significant extent. It's a huge industry. So, we've had universities who've been thinking about going online and teaching online from the classrooms, and have completely changed their curriculum to be able to deliver that online within 1 week. So it's nothing like a bit of desperation, and we have to adjust here to force that kind of thinking. But, local schools having to teach their students online, and having teachers having to use technology they've never used before and wouldn't even think about using before. I heard we were lucky we could still go down and get a coffee every day. And in my laneway, there's a couple of teachers, and they're like, I've never heard of Microsoft Teams. Now I have to use it every day. But they were loving it. In those who are already in online education or corporate learning online, the demand for that kind of service has taken off. Industries that normally have workshops or have people coming in or training that way, they're now trying to move their offering online. So I see this as an area that has been forced to adapt, but what it's learning will take it into the future. And even in a country like Indonesia, where the government is providing money to people to do online training just so that they stay busy while they don't have a job, or they learn a new skill that can help them in the future. So education, which is now being forced online, has become one of the ways that we can get through this. and we're learning new things. We're not saying it should all be online, but we've definitely realised that we can do some of it online, and especially for those countries, say in Southeast Asia, where everyone's connected on their smartphone, they don't have access to a computer, and the internet may not always be great. But if you can get something on a smartphone that helps them train and learn, and maybe even be connected to some science or some research, imagine being able to do that. That to me is perhaps one of the optimistic elements of this pandemic.
Sure,
So,
perhaps opportunities for business. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
So two other industries which are a success story, which hasn't been recognized very well. One is telecom. Actually, in all this, every one of us was using Wi-Fi and the consuming videos, and on an exponential basis, the entire education industry, as Helen mentioned, the online education is contingent upon telecom providers being able to supply Wi-Fi and broadband, etc. And this success story hasn't been examined very well as to how they've been able to scale up and deliver this exponential data deluge, as it were. So I believe there was a lot of innovations done by the telecom industry, which has not yet discussed in public domain so much. So that's one thing. The other is telemedicine. So in New York City, I've had a lot of appointments by doctors through the telemedicine apps. And I think that's another one which has really, which will see a lot of scaling up in the future. And for a country like India, where the number of doctors, one doctor caters to as many as 2,000 people, which is way beyond the WHO landmark of about 1,000. So therefore, for a country like that, telemedicine could be a real good game changer in terms of providing good quality health to people around the country. So I thought these two industries we should take an eye and keep a view on.
Right. Well, and it seems like there's a common thread there with all three of those industries in terms of how they're able to adapt and leverage digital and make sure that it's got staying power. But I do appreciate that perspective on education. I'm the daughter of a retired teacher, and I've also seen how parents are now appreciating teachers more, at least in the U.S., in terms of the role that they play now that so much has been done from home and put a burden on parents especially. Jesper, did you want to jump in on this?
No, I just wanted to say, on the tourism side, obviously Japan, has been very dependent on inbound tourism. But the good news is now nobody goes to Hawaii; they all go to Okinawa. So ironically, sort of being creative. It's not everything is lost, right? As long as people have jobs and have their purchasing power, Americans are still going to have the summer holidays, and somebody's going to have to do something. So another example, just sort of Helen made me laugh because there's a couple of hotel chains here in Japan that have pivoted and are now supplying basically WeWork style office space. And as you know, for Japanese, it's all very nice and well to say, you work from home, but home in Tokyo, certainly in Osaka, certainly tends to be pretty small and pretty cramped. And so the hotels came up with special offers, which are actually subsidized by the government, which is very nice. So you're basically paying, instead of, whatever a room rate would have been, let's say 10,000 yen, now you're only paying, 5,000 yen, and half of it is covered by the government, which is actually quite an innovative way, right, to sort of use the capacity of hotels, right, at least in the urban areas, as office space while this is going on.
Right. Well, I want to come right back to you, Jesper, actually, because I wanted to talk a little bit more about the geographic level situation, the country level, I should say, and how different countries are digesting all this and moving forward with plans. And I know you wrote a recent commentary in the Japan Times, and the first line caught my eye because you said Japan would be set to emerge stronger, which is a phrase that here in Singapore we hear a lot. It was actually #EmergeStronger in the early days as a government message that they wanted to say, we're going to get through this, and they've used it throughout the crisis. So that really caught my eye. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about why, given all the Japanese domestic economic challenges that they were battling even before the crisis, the consumer tax hike and everything else, how are they positioned?
It's my favorite topic, so I'm gonna try and keep it very brief. Let me just say, focusing on three elements here. The first one is, trust me, you want to be a 23-year-old Japanese. Because obviously, the surge in unemployment, everywhere is hitting the young generation particularly hard. But now the demographics is definitely going to be a plus. Remember, 25 to 35-year-old cohort is dropping every year by 250,000 people here in Japan. So if you're a 23-year-old Japanese, yes, you're going to have difficulties finding a job, but this year. But structurally, the fact that Japan is running out of young people, so to speak, is actually definitely a good thing, for the bargaining power, and the wage and job prospects for the younger generation here. The second thing is that Japanese companies are unbelievably rich. As you know, Japanese corporations have been hoarding cash. They've got about $6 trillion of cash and liquid securities on their balance sheet. And using this cash now to, number one, maintain relatively robust employment and pay levels, but number two, to actually buy cheap assets, to buy cheap companies. And you're seeing this, for example, very specifically, I'm not just talking, but you're actually seeing that in the regional banking system, over the last couple of weeks, you've started to see a wave of mergers and acquisitions. So these war chest of cash that corporate Japan has is now being used to make those acquisitions. And I actually am very convinced that over the next 6 to 9 months, once it becomes clear what type of regime we have in the United States, I do think that Japanese companies will engage in outward direct investment, particularly in Asia Pacific. And then last but not least, is this fact that you've got these behavioral changes, that the rigidities of decision-making, the rigidities of process within individual companies is being unlocked, is being broken open, because of the corona pandemic. And as a result of that, I think that the efficiencies within individual companies, within individual industries is actually going to be improving.
Well, I'm mindful of the time. We're kind of running up against the Q&A, and I do want to get to these questions that are already in the queue. But first, if I could just briefly ask Ashwini and Helen to chime in here. Ashwini, for India, how do you assess the outlook for the international business environment there, given that, we're hearing about Prime Minister Modi's plans, of course, for Make in India and trying to accelerate that to kind of localize supply chains. But what is the feeling on the ground as to whether, they might reap some gains of maybe some of these businesses that are looking to diversify their supply chains into India, as some of the talk was last year amid the trade wars?
Yeah, so as far as India is concerned, our economy was slowing even before the COVID pandemic came in. So our GDP growth rate was down from about 7 to 8%, as it was for almost 4 or 5 years, to 4.2%. And now this year it is expected, because of the COVID, it is expected to contract maybe to minus 3% as per the credit rating agencies. So therefore, Indian economy was slowing. And the emphasis on local manufacturing and for people to come into India has been a focus area for the government. A lot of nut and bolt issues, or rather I would call them systemic issues, have been resolved. For example, the GST, which is the value-added tax, was implemented in 2016. And this was a landmark legislation which was in the works for almost 30 years. Alongside the Bankruptcy Act, which again was implemented almost in the same year. So these two together were acts which were meant to actually resolve a lot of issues which businesses used to face in India. And therefore, it was a work in progress. Having said that, there were definitely other issues. For example, the infrastructure. Now, there was a lot of work done on roads and ports, etc. But there's still a lot to catch up to the other countries in the region. What we have seen in the recent past is a little bit of a fallback on the tariffs area, which was one thing where the political side was always agreed on in terms of liberalizing and reducing it. But as countries around the world put more tariffs, created more barriers, especially starting with the US, India was forced to respond to the demands of its own industry. And to me, that in the long term is slightly negative, because if everybody starts to put barriers or walls, that doesn't help. I mean, we have had immense prosperity due to the open trade which has been there. And in this pandemic, we have seen that despite the WHO being talked about negatively by some few countries, had the WHO coordinates and the mechanism not been there, the Chinese would not have been able to post the DNA of the virus on the website, and people around the world would have devised tests and started working with the vaccine. So the cooperation, whether it is in trade or health, is very, very important. As far as shifting of companies from China to countries like India, I think India is attracting some attention there. There are some companies which are coming here. In terms of Japanese companies specifically, I mean, Jesper mentioned about that. They are already present in full strength in India. We have an enclave in Rajasthan called Nimrana, which is all Japanese companies. And they are all supporting the larger auto companies which are there. So therefore, this shifting has been happening for some time, more to cater to the local market rather than building for the world. But that again is something which is happening in auto components. It already happened. A lot of Japanese companies are exporting around the world from India now. They came in for the local demand, but because it is such a large market itself. So I believe for the Indian market itself, that would probably, people would come in and then try to, if it works, they might try to export to the world.
So still kind of an experimental period in some senses, but maybe an acceleration of some plans. Helen, I wanted to ask you specifically about Indonesia, because I know you followed that quite closely, and they have a particularly unique story on the ground right now, and unfortunately not a very successful one at the moment in terms of curbing the virus. But what I sense from investors, at least when you look at the stability of the currency, is that they don't seem as concerned. At least they seem to show some satisfaction with the policy response so far. I mean, is there a dissonance here, and where do you see these two tracks moving forward?
The coronavirus pandemic also hit Indonesia just as the President Joko Widodo was putting through an omnibus bill, which was covering a wide range of regulations, which would have made investment into the country easier, or smoother, and reduced a lot of the regulatory hold-ups that occur and have stopped investment into Indonesia. And, you know, interestingly, he kick-started this bill because he saw that business was moving out of China and into Southeast Asia, but not into Indonesia. So Vietnam, for instance, was getting the business. And this concerned him because he wants to get the manufacturing sector back up to a particular level. He has 260 million people who are looking to improve their skill level and improve their jobs. So he had this grand plan. It was in Parliament. It was being thwarted a little bit. The trade unions there were concerned about some elements of it. And then coronavirus hit. It's hard to tell what's going to happen with that next. I was in a briefing today, actually, and no one really had an answer as to whether the president would be able to take that forward. I guess, you know, his attention's been diverted on trying to balance the need for economic growth with the impact, the health impact of this virus. And in terms of, you know, will we see investment going into the region? As you said, the rupiah has improved a bit over the last short while. The finance minister, the professionals in finance and treasury are giving out positive messages or messages of, you know, certainty around, look, there will be a hit to the economy, and, you know, it's going to be quite a lot for an economy that was growing at around 5% a year. But we think we can manage it, you know. So while there might be a strong hit, they feel that the stability will remain in place. So that's the message that's coming out. Now, at the moment, the signs are that that's the case, but, you know, who knows? And I guess this is another great unknown, is that Indonesia's officially recording 1,000 cases a day of people contracting coronavirus. They're not able to test as much as they would like. It's hard to get a true fix on what's happening. There are certain parts of Indonesia which are really getting slammed by this. And it's an economy that, to a large extent is still a street economy. People rely on those jobs that you see out on the street, just at a time when they're wanting to grow people's skills level, attract more investment, and take Indonesia to the place that we know it can get to, and would like to see it to get to help everyone there. But I think it's just hard to tell at this stage, Michelle, where it's going to go. But the sense is that the stability is there at the moment. That's certainly the messages that are coming out.
Well, I heard you say the word stability a few times, and it seems to be the key word for a lot of governments that can't hope for growth this year with contractions across the board in Asia, but perhaps stability is a sign that things will hit bottom and move into some sort of shape recovery that's favorable, if not a V. I want to move to some of the comments. It's a reassuring word. Yeah. Stability does offer some comfort. I want to move to some of the comments and questions that we've been getting. First, I'll just offer, Jesper, this seems more geared toward your comment on what Abenomics tried to achieve, COVIDnomics made us achieve. Des from YouTube says there's a blog that needs to be authored on that topic. So I'll leave that to you to author that blog when you have a chance in your free time. Michael Strauss from YouTube also is talking quite a bit about pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And he's asking, one of his questions is there a path forward where current and future disease can be tackled through intergovernmental and interbusiness cooperation? So I'm curious to hear any of you, what are your hopes for that sort of cooperation in the future?
If I may offer a few comments here, actually, I'm not an expert in pharma or biotechnology for that matter, but only from the purpose, from the experience of having dealt with a few Indian companies, pharma companies, and also the current experience of seeing how the pharma companies who are testing various vaccines, biotechnology companies which are testing various vaccines and trying to prepare. We have seen an enormous amount of collaboration happening at the moment for COVID. Now, whether this will sustain as a way going forward, considering that the IP regime which is there and a lot of profits which are there in big pharma is hard to tell. And therefore, there is clearly a role for intergovernmental scheme of things. For example, like the IPCC in the climate change. It has been able to accomplish a lot, though the actual implementation may or may not have happened to the extent desired. But bringing the world on a stage, I think WHO can play that role, and maybe the charter of the WHO could be looked at to see whether such collaborations, especially for diseases, not only COVID, but there are multiple other diseases, infectious diseases especially, which need collaboration around the world. And unless the labs and the research labs and the companies collaborate with each other, wouldn't work properly. So I guess there is clearly a role for this kind of a collaboration going forward, and an institutional structure is definitely going to be helpful.
And with the institutions, I'm guessing that means that might be more cemented, and it won't be just a passing thought to cooperate in crisis and move on after that. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic, Helen? About
Indonesia or generally?
About the cooperation between government and business, I should say.
Sorry. Of course. Sorry, Michael. Look, I don't know. My feeling is that big business has very set patterns of how to do business. And they also have, boards and directors who are used to doing business a certain way. And it's very hard to step out of your comfort zone when you're used to that, which is not to say there are innovative and progressive people in business, but it's that, they're the top 20, and then you've got the majority and what they base their decisions on and how they base them, and, where they sit in an organization. It seems to be very deep rooted. But then you do have, from what we're seeing and hearing, is sort of the younger or the middle level of management who are keen to do things differently, who are keen to look at things differently, who are asking for a voice at the table. So maybe they are the ones that will drive more of this thinking around, can we use this? How can we use this as a lesson? The science has been so useful to us. Perhaps is there a way to incorporate that more in what we do? And you'll be having the younger people in those organizations who their personal values want to be more aligned with the work that they do. So they'll be looking to see if who they work for is adopting some of these changes, some of these new ways of doing things. I mean, maybe this is a bit idealistic, but it's just some of the messages that we're getting back. And I mean, I'd be really interested to hear the views of my two panelists, because I know that one of the things we work on is changing perceptions of Australian business about Indonesia, and also changing perceptions of business generally about doing business in Asia. And it's not easy, because so there are so many things which are already preconceived, and there are set patterns and ways of doing things and thinking about things that haven't had to be changed, haven't really been challenged. Maybe this is the time when they are being challenged. And this is a time for other voices to come in and hear about, well, we do have to look at things differently now. We do have to consider a different way, or maybe we have to wait 10 years.
Well, Jesper, you talked quite a bit about the upending of the corporate culture in Japan. I mean, is intergovernmental and interbusiness cooperation, businesses and governments talking together, is that part of the changes that you're seeing?
No, look, I mean, the business community, working together, with the Japanese government. I mean, they're very, very pragmatic here. I mean, the Abe administration is no different from the other administrations in that respect. I mean, they do listen to science, they do listen to business, and they come up with a weighted average here. But to pick up on Helen's point, that's the really interesting one. And I do think that, what I guess in the West we call work-life balance, which, sort of a Japanese, shakaijin, somebody who graduates from university and joins, the Mitsubishi clan, there's no question that that's your number one priority. I do think, that is starting to break open. That was a trend that was already, starting to happen. And I think that, the whole sort of work-life balance, why am I stuck for 2 hours on a commute every day when really all I need to do is maybe be in the office, once a week or twice a week or something like that. And it's very interesting, Michelle, one of the monsters of Japan, Hitachi Corporation, is moving to a 3-day work week. And the rest is from telecommute. I mean, this is revolution. This is like the Meiji Restoration, that is there. The second thing that is very, very interesting, and that, as you know, in Japan, in terms of the corporate culture, the intake of the university graduates, tends to be, on the 1st of April, which was right in the middle of COVID. And so it's very interesting that the as it were, the class of 2020, is actually by definition not part of the normal indoctrination programs, that Japanese corporations are running. And it's very, very interesting, because of course, and it's I just had a lunch today with some sort of bucho, what is that, sort of general department managers, right? And they were actually very mindful of saying, okay, it's not just business as usual in terms of indoctrinating them with the corporate culture, but we actually have to listen to them and their demands, because they can actually teach us something. So I do think that Japan is going to be a very special case, in the sense of that the culture has been very rigid at the corporate level, and the corona pandemic is actually a catalyst, for something new, for something innovative.
It's amazing too. You mentioned that just the date of April 1st, and not having to go through the same process as you did the year before or the year before that, and what that can do to the mindset once corporates see, everything didn't fall apart when we didn't do this or that. So maybe we can continue on. It's the same mindset of working from home that I see some managers talking about. Well, I guess my employees can do this and achieve certain things at home that they didn't expect.
So Michelle, I think the thing that I'm worried about, and the bigger challenge, was actually the international linkages. I mean, everybody has, of course, challenges within their home market, within their headquarters office, within their regional offices, etc., within the country, but of course, a Japanese transplant or a Japanese joint venture in Indonesia, in India, as long as you don't have that human exchange, and we all know, I mean, look, you can do Zoom conferences, you can do all these things to get by and get things done, but at the end of the day, a night out or an evening out, with your coworkers, goes way, way more distance and is way more productive in terms of forging bridges, than anything that you can do electronically. So I think, that aspect, yes, the localization of the mindset is necessary and imperative, but particularly for Asia, which is such a bizarre economy of networks, right? And, that's going to be the next challenge going forward.
Yeah, well, and certainly from a communication standpoint, it's hard for me to argue with that. Helen, did you want to add to that?
Well, I just realized I was a bit dissing of business when you think about it, though, in Australia and elsewhere, there are some examples where government particularly is stepping in because of the coronavirus, or for Australia, we just have an economic agreement with Indonesia, and they're looking at how to combine research and industry and science and values into something that is applicable to industry and is mutually beneficial. So there is that thinking definitely going on. This is through the work with the 11 universities between Indonesia and Australia that I'm involved with, that there is more thinking about a more holistic approach. I perhaps still stand by my thinking that it might take another generation of senior managers, but what's happening in Japan, who would have ever thought that? So maybe this is accelerating ideas and opportunities in ways we hadn't even imagined.
And if I could just stay with you for a second, Helen, there's a question from Sean King from YouTube. In the age of COVID-19, how do Australian businesses now view the US market?
Oh, right. Gosh. I don't know if I could.
In 30 seconds or less.
Australian business. Look, Australian business, they generally have had a love affair with the US. They look to it for ideas and innovation, and it's exciting and interesting. And, obviously the Australians align a lot with the US in terms of culture and values. So I don't think that has eased, and we've seen the stock market as well. Everyone watches the American stock market here. Hard to know, Sean, but I don't think there's going to be a breakup anytime soon.
Well, there's another geographic focused question, but this more in line with South Asia. Ashwini, I wonder if you might have any thoughts on this. Sridhar from Facebook asks, any hopes for Sri Lanka, especially IT and the cybersecurity sector there?
So clearly, I do not have an idea about what the cybersecurity or IT situation in Sri Lanka is, but Sri Lanka has done pretty well in terms of human indicators. In fact, in the region, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are two countries which have been a success story as far as the social uplift and the human indicators are concerned. The education levels, sanitation levels, the various measures like infant mortality rate, etc., by which you measure the progress, they've done a good job, and in fact, they are much better than India and Pakistan. Pakistan actually is a kind of a laggard in the region. As far as the IT cybersecurity goes, Sri Lanka does get some benefit out of the large Indian companies which have set up everywhere, all countries, including in China, Japan, and also in Sri Lanka. So they have set up a few centers in Sri Lanka as well. And therefore, to that extent, they are gaining, the IT industry there and the local professionals there are gaining the experience from the Indian experience, which is in turn connected to the US large companies and the European companies, and therefore are exposed to the best practices and the best technologies which are out there.
So that proximity is helping quite a bit. There's one that's kind of more on your patch, Jesper. Nancy Snow from Facebook says, way to go, Hitachi. Now can the government open the country up to those of us who work in the international classroom? We need a plan.
Thank you. I mean, this is, look, the opening up of the country, and this is not just a Japanese issue. It's like, the fact that, the sort of initial suggestions are based on nationality rather than on residency. I mean, that's, for all intents and purposes, absurd, and it's, you can see where that's coming from, right? But you're spot on. How are we going to get, whether it's these travel bubbles or, what sort of international agreement are we going to get, right? Is this track and trace? Is there going to be an agreement for track and trace? I mean, clearly, if I leave and have to quarantine for 20 days or for 2 weeks, and then do business and then come back and quarantine for 2 weeks, I mean, that's just not going to be happening there. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, that needs to be done, and where we need clarity over the next couple of months.
Email question from Margarita Camacho, a little bit of a different tack we're moving along here. And this one might not seem as a COVID question at first, but I think that perhaps the urgency of the moment is prompting this. But she asked, what is the biggest nightmare that the panelists see in terms of cybersecurity? And do businesses have a plan to keep consumers safe from a cyber pandemic? Viruses come in all forms.
Okay, so if I may start off here, because as a bank, we deal with consumers and businesses. Sure. And bulk of that was already happening digitally, and this has increased quite significantly in this situation. And one of the risks which we find happening not only with consumers, but also in our own branches, because a lot of stuff is happening digitally, the cyber security risks have increased tremendously. There's a lot of social engineering which is going on. People are making attempts to get into the system, not only of the bank, also the customers. Phishing and all were pretty common even earlier, but now with this happening and with the people being served digitally, I think these risks have gone up manifold. And in cybersecurity, we are generally always playing catch up. I mean, it is very unsettling to see on the some of the agencies, the cybersecurity agencies, come up to us and show us the names and passwords which are available in the dark web for sale, etc. So these things have already been going on. Now, the more we go digital, the more cybersecurity issues are increasing, and it's only, I mean, we can only hope to have a mixture of perhaps some element of physical in terms of tokens, etc., to be able to stay a little ahead and stay safe. Of course, the things like cyber insurance and various other procedures and training is a continuous process. All that helps, but it's a big risk at the moment.
Is that something that at State Bank of India that you've invested more time in over the past few months? Is digital, just cybersecurity measures and that sort of thing?
It's an ongoing thing, but we have been more focused. I mean, as we speak, we are upgrading a lot of stuff around State Bank of India, not only in India, but also here in New York and elsewhere. Because we understand that cybersecurity is something which has multiple dimensions. It is not only the question of loss in a particular transaction. It is a question of the reputation of the bank. It is a question of the reliability of the system per se. So in case there is a breach, in case there is some event which happens either at the customer end or at our end, it leads to a lot of multiple side effects. So therefore, we are upgrading our systems all the time in this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but I did want to ask one kind of forward-looking question as we talk about some of these travel restrictions and only just starting to see some relief in that respect for businesses where, countries like Singapore and China are developing a travel channel for essential business, but with a lot of strings attached in terms of itinerary and testing and, 14-day isolation and factors of that sort to ensure the health and safety of those traveling. I mean, what do each of you see as the timeline around this sort of opening up on the travel lanes, and how are businesses thinking about this? I mean, I remember early in our conversation, Helen, you were saying that a lot of businesses are using the fallback as what is the government health ministry saying, and we'll just follow that advice. Are businesses going to be a little bit more eager to push the envelope on this, or are they going to be perhaps more conservative than what the government is offering? I mean, where do you see the timeline of getting back to business travel?
I a tricky one to answer, and we actually put this question a couple of weeks ago to some businesses in the room, and the answer was, we don't know. We just don't know. So in Australia, they've started traveling more domestically for business, and they were saying that even to go from Melbourne to Sydney, for instance, a very big conversation takes place at senior levels around, does this person need to go? What protocols have been put in place? You know, how do we ensure their safety every step of the way? Is this essential travel? So you have to have those conversations just on a domestic level. As you know, there's talk of a travel bubble between New Zealand and Australia opening up, which will be dependent on how we handle the current situation. But I think that would be more for tourism, to try and help each other's tourism economies more than anything else. In terms of international travel, I'm pretty sure no one's thinking until next year at least. You know, it's just not on the radar at all until 2021. That's what I keep hearing. And it really depends on how the virus keeps spreading in other parts of the world.
Michelle,
if you've got a private plane, it's different, of course. But yeah, I do keep hearing that people, I mean, for sport, they're thinking about, you know, they're still thinking about playing cricket and bringing the cricket team in, Pakistan and India and going to Britain, you know, so maybe it can be managed. But as you say, if you're traveling for business, you don't want to go somewhere and then you can't quarantine for 14 days, come back, quarantine for another 14 days. Yeah.
Michelle.
Yes.
Yeah, Michelle, if I can chime here, and you talk about the pressure from business is going to continue to ratchet up, you know, because, you know, for a whole bunch of reasons, you know, you just can't, you just need the big decisions, right? Real decisions are made face to face. And that's not going to change for quite a long time. And as a result of that, you know, if you don't open up for international travel, you know, a lot of the American education system is going to go into bankruptcy. Think about that in terms of the dependence that you've got there. So the pressure there, you know, I don't want to argue with the science of the virologists of the pandemics here, but if you talk about you know, at the end of the day, it's a power game. Who makes the decision? Well, of course, it's the government that makes the decision. But in terms of the pressure that is going to be put on, and remember that, you know, actually Europe, you know, is opening up. Right? You know, you can now travel from Germany to France to Portugal to yada. And so we shall see. There'll be lots of data points coming through that. But at the end of the day, the key question is, I think Asia is going to be very, very pragmatic about going about this, right? With these travel bubbles coming through. The big question mark is the US. The big question mark is the US, because you've got a federal government and you've got local governments that don't necessarily see eye to eye. And, you know, for all intents and purposes, are going to start to look less eye to eye between now and November. Sorry, that's I'm speaking like a Japanese. We're very concerned about this.
It seems more politically palatable to push the sort of domestic tourism and say you don't need to go abroad for that. Whereas for business, I see where there are a lot of urgencies that they're feeling, and the pressures are on for the policymakers to make that decision. But Ashwini, can you close us out on this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to continue from where Jesper signed off, in the US especially, we had Governor Cuomo from New York yesterday putting out a statement saying that maybe Florida is saying a lot of spike, maybe we should stop people from Florida from coming into New York City. I mean, imagine New York City, which some time back was being considered to be blocked out by the rest of the state. So this is definitely what happens in the US is an issue, but clearly the business international travel with these protocols currently of 14 days on either side is just not sustainable. So therefore, at the moment, that's not happening. Nobody is planning for it. I mean, only people who have to go for some place, maybe on a transfer or something, only those people are considering, even those are pushing back. The one on a positive side, one example which I saw in Hong Kong, I mean, my daughter is going tomorrow to Hong Kong, so we found out the protocols. They test everybody who comes into the airport then and there, make them wait for 8-10 hours. And then if the test is positive, you go to the hospital. If the test is negative, then you go and self-isolate at home. So I think some version of that, if we are able to put in 100% testing at the airports, which gives confidence to the income to the country, the host country, and the businesses, that is the only way probably we can start off this. Because as yet, everything else is unknown. Will there be a second wave? Will there be another peak? And as long as there are countries where there are cases, I don't think any country can feel safe, even though they create bubbles, etc. So this is something, a big uncertainty and big unknown.
All right. Well, as Helen mentioned, we're hearing a lot that this won't happen for this year, but maybe early next. But I guess we'll have to see how that situation unfolds over the coming months and who endeavors to take that business travel and how it goes and whether businesses deem it worth it. We'll see. But unfortunately, we have to close there. Leave it at that last question. And I think we did a lot to kind of build momentum out of the first panel from our scientists and talking about the challenges that they were seeing from the scientific side and how they hoped that businesses would take some of these lessons and continue to open those communications channels so that these communities can talk together about how to defeat the virus and to live with it in some senses. So just to sum up both sessions, a few big points I can run through. I've been trying to jot down and catch up with all the big themes that you all were offering in the course of our conversation. I mean, I think one thing is the tremendous uncertainty, of course, has been underlined throughout this discussion, and also the idea, and I really liked how you put this, Helen, but the fallback on science and the guidance there, and how a lot of businesses are using that as the default to look to their health ministries and use that as the standard for how they're going to practice, at least in the near term. And I understand that it can be jarring when, as you say, Ashwini, that science is typically a more straightforward science, to put it that way, that you have solutions and it's, the things are cut out, but this is a very uncharted territory in that respect and can be further jarring to businesses trying to sort that out. We talked a lot about leveraging digital in ways, hopefully that might be longer lasting for sectors from education to telecoms to Jesper, you talked about the upending of corporate culture in Japan across industries. So there are hopes that perhaps some of the lessons that we've learned already will be sustainable over the long term. Of course, supply chains have played a big part of it. We didn't get to talk too much about it, but already seeing that movement from last year in the trade war and whether or not we can see these geographies continue to kind of build on gains to figure out their long-term strategy and hopefully solidify some sort of idea of how they're going to better build that resiliency that we talked about for their long-term businesses. We talked about some cooperation between government and business, which was something that came out of our day one panel, was that desire for the scientists to see more of that, to see more of a communication between all these communities so that you can continue to have that cooperation. Ashwini, you mentioned that WHO should also help play a role as as governments try to work this out and share their responses and lessons learned. And lastly, some of this is going to be very tough going forward, but in talking about international travel, the big stuff happens in person, as you say, Jesper, and I think a lot of industries are feeling like, yes, work from home can be great for a time, but not everything can get done from where we are sitting right now. So hopefully there are things that shake out from this that we're able to find a happy medium. But I want to thank all of you, first and foremost, the panelists, for your great insights and to help us think how we can grow beyond COVID and how we might all emerge stronger, as we talked about earlier, from this crisis, and how businesses can kind of build on that sort of planning structure. Thank you also to the Asia Society and the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology that made these conversations over the course of the 2 days possible, and for our expert panels on both days. And thank you to the audience for joining us from around the world and for being a part of this ongoing conversation. I hope you find the videos that are posted this week useful and relevant beyond just these 2 days. So in the meantime, stay healthy and well, and thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sayonara.